Trade. There may be no word within the ARPG genre that sparks more controversy than the word trade. It probably doesn't help that there are two major games in the genre, Diablo 3 and Path of Exile, and they both handle trade in completely different ways. They couldn't really be much more opposite. Diablo 3 says you can trade in your party with things that had dropped while you were playing, and that's literally it. Nothing else. Extremely restricted. And Path of Exile says you can trade whatever you want as long as you're willing to do it with no help from us, third-party tools, websites, and go find that person and meet up with them with, you know, some minor exceptions like the ability to post stuff in your stash tabs. Outside of that, though, trade whatever you want. Just do it on your own. Don't bother us. Couldn't be much different between the two games. You can see why anytime anyone brings up trade in another game in the genre, like Last Epoch, and the concept of it, people get very concerned because they're worried that the version of trade that they like the most is not going to be the one they get. And for some people, that's enough to completely ruin their experience with the game. There's a lot of people who won't play Path of Exile because they don't want to deal with that trade system because just the way it's set up is so unfun to them that they just can't be bothered to deal with that, especially with how important it is to that game in general. And then others on the opposite side that won't play Diablo 3 because they can't trade. They can't be a part of an economy. And that's really enjoyable to them and a vital part of their experience. So when we think about Last Epoch and where it's at, you can see why people are concerned about it, and there are forum posts that go on for literally hundreds of replies with everyone telling everyone else exactly how they think trade should be and how the opposite side is just completely wrong on it. There's no reason why you should ever make the game that way. It should definitely be this way. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to outline trade for Last Epoch historically. What has it been planned to be? What the problems with that system were and why it was scrapped? What we know about it currently? And finally, I'm going to provide my idea of what I think would be the closest thing to the best of both worlds that we could get if they implemented it. The closest thing to making everyone happy. You'll never make everyone happy, especially in a system like this where the views are so extreme in comparison to each other. But I do think there's a system out there that gets close and will get most people to a state where they're satisfied with it. And I'll finish with that. We'll go through that stuff in pretty good detail, and I'll be very curious to see how others feel about this, whether you think I'm just completely off the mark on this or whether you agree. But before we do that, let's go ahead and get the history of where the game was planned to be trade-wise. And then we'll talk about what the goals of trade should be or are actually, both for EHG and for the players. And then, finally, I will present to you what I think they could do. It's not the only way they could solve this problem or these problems, but I think they could do to make it work. And with that, let's start with the history of Last Epoch trade. When it comes to trade in Last Epoch, there was actually originally a pretty detailed concept of what trade was going to be. Now, unfortunately, as we're going to talk about in a bit, they have since abandoned the idea. And in doing so, have went back and edited a lot of areas where the information was. So it's actually really hard to find accurate information that's recent, which is not like they didn't do anything wrong. Like that's what you do when you change plans. You make sure that the old information is sort of not going to confuse players. Because of that, I don't really have a lot of sources. So you're going to have to kind of trust me just as someone who's played this game for the last few years and really, really follows closely and is in touch with the developers a lot, that what I'm saying is what they actually had meant to happen, and because of what they had told us and the feedback we provided, they have since abandoned it. But you can go back as far as April 2018 to find out some ideas of what their trading was gonna be like, and it was gonna be a bazaar system. Now, I was gonna read through this, but it turns out that this actually, the system that they had outlined in April of 2018 is a lot closer to what I think they should do than what they had outlined more recently and what we had criticized. So I'm not going to go through this, but I'm going to use this here as just like an example of how far back they've had a pretty distinct idea of what they wanted to do. Now, the more recent stuff has been much less auction housey than what this post has put out, because in this post, the bazaar is effectively an auction house. But in a follow-up information that was quite a number of years later, both in live streams and on the forums, what they outlined was much more like the traditional bazaar of the MMO style, where you would put up a store and people could go over and browse your store and only your store or someone else's only at any given time and look and see if they could find some stuff. In fact, on a dev stream, Mike once sort of explained it as like flipping through records at a record store, like the old school style music stores, where like they just have like piles, like have like shelves of records, and you can just flip through them and like see what's there and see if anything caught your eye, and maybe something would, and then maybe you'd buy it, or maybe it wouldn't and you wouldn't buy it. Much different than an auction house system in, say, World of Warcraft, where it was going to be kind of hard to find what you wanted because at any given time you didn't know what was going to be available. That was what was basically described. So we were going to have a bazaar system where you could list your stuff and have your own little store. And through a hub system, it's possible that someone would come across your store, and because they came across your store, they might browse it, and through browsing it, they might find something that they like and they might purchase it. That was, to the community's understanding, how the trade system was going to work up until a few months ago. And the devs never really told us anything different than that. Like, that was how it was explained to us, and we were never corrected on that. And so it created a lot of concerns, because that's a high friction system for the player. It may seem like it's fairly easy compared to like PoE, but the thing with PoE is because there's third-party apps, and because you could invite anyone at any time to your group, you could trade with anyone who had anything, and you could find anything that they had at any given time just using the search function in third-party apps. So it was actually, in my opinion, higher friction to use the bazaar system, and it was far less likely that you were going to find the item that you wanted if it worked as described, and we could only assume that it did. So you'd have to go to someone's store, and again, there's no guarantee there'd be even a search function within that store. Maybe there would be. Maybe there'd be a larger search function, which would have been great, but was never explained that way. And you might get lucky and find something that you like. But for most players who go to a trading system and are looking to trade, they're usually looking for something specific. They're not looking to peruse records effectively. They're not going to like try to find a new band to listen to. They're trying to find a very specific band that they really like. In fact, when it comes to record stores, that's how it usually worked anyway. Like, yeah, there were people that would go in there and just like peruse them and see if they could find something new, and that was kind of cool. But oftentimes you're going in there looking for that very specific band or that very specific singer that you wanted, and it was listed alphabetical order A to Z, and it was very easy to find them. So even in the old school systems, it seemed like of record stores, it seemed less friction, more frictionless, however you want to word that, than this bazaar system would be. And so we had a scenario where the player base just really wasn't happy with what they were hearing about a trade system, because if you're going to implement trade, then make it in a way that's enjoyable for the players and actually accomplishes the mission of trading that the player has. Now, some people don't like trade, and I'm going to try not to talk about that too much, but we do need to address it, and that's okay as long as you balance for a non-trade environment, which they are, and that way we will address that in a minute. Like, the way that make this system to where people who don't like trade can still be satisfied is just make a version where you don't need to trade, where you're balanced to not trade, an SSF where you can get at your own gear, and you can just literally not trade in an environment that doesn't have trade, and you're good. But if you're going to offer trade, which EHG has said they're going to do all along, then you need to make it satisfying for the people who actually do want to trade. And that was where the problem was between the player base and 11th Hour Games as far as what they were describing as a trade system and how we were envisioning our experiences. And I personally was like, well, if it works the way that you're describing it and the way I'm envisioning it, then I just won't trade, because it would actually be less effective for me to try and trade. I would spend so much time in there just looking for any item that's any value to me when I could probably drop 10 or 20 or 30 during that same period of time just by playing the game. And to some extent, you could say, well, that was their point. They don't want trade to overpower gear acquisition. And I fully agree that that should be done. But it shouldn't be to the extent to where trading becomes irrelevant or completely undesirable to do at all. There should be some balance to where there are times when you want to trade and feel rewarded for trading. And then there are times where you don't want to trade. You want to go get the gear in the world and you feel rewarded for that. And so that's what all led us to the point where we are at now, which is there no longer is a bazaar system. It is no longer an option, or at least the current plan. In the January 27th development update of this year, so this is very recent, they dropped it. So we have, let's see, go ahead and quick search this so it doesn't take long. There we go. So they said the final system we want to discuss is the bazaar. We spoke to our ideas regarding the bazaar in the multiplayer FAQ in July of last year, which is the thing I wanted to reference here, but has now changed to reflect that it's not a bazaar. Since then, we listened very carefully to all the dialogue concerning trade and had a lot of conversation internally as a result. After a lot of discussion about the various challenges to our proposed direction, we no longer feel the bazaar is the best way to go about player trading in Last Epoch. While player trading will still be a part of the game, we're planning to take a different approach. We will be talking more about our reasoning here, as well as the future of trading in Last Epoch, in a dedicated post in the coming months. Now, let's talk about where they are at currently, which is exactly what you're reading here. There is no additional information whatsoever on trading in Last Epoch beyond this. The coming months so far have not actually given us any new information on trading. So where we're currently at with trading is exactly what you can read here. Bazaar is not it. Player trading will still be a part of the game. It is not clear at all how big of a part of it is, but it will be there. It'll be a different approach from the bazaar. And they're going to talk about it, the future of trading in Last Epoch in the future. This is literally all we know. I can't stress enough. There's no other information. We don't know if it's going to be a D3 style where you just have to be in a party and drop it. Like, that's the bare minimum, right? It can't be any less than that, or else you don't have trading. It could be that. Actually, we do know slightly more. I take that back, because when asking the devs, we have gotten an answer along the lines of, we don't want it to be a full economy simulator. Think PoE. We don't want a scenario where you play the game just to play the economy, which still leaves open just about everything else, right? Doesn't mean you can't have an auction house. Doesn't mean you can't have like a robust economy. It just means that they don't want it to be like the overpowering. They don't want it to be like in PoE where some people play the game to trade. Like, trading is like their primary reason for it. You can think that's good or bad. That's fine. But that's what they don't want. They don't want that exactly to happen here. Outside of that, though, what we're going to get is anyone's guess. And so that's why I want to go through a few things that they've said, some of their goals, as well as some of the goals of the community, to get an idea of what it might look like and maybe what it should look like when trade is fully implemented in Last Epoch. So we've covered where trade is in the Last Epoch realm as far as what we know, what it used to be or was going to be, and why that didn't work out. So for the last part, or parts, I want to talk about two things in particular. One is where it needs to be, where trade should be in order to appease or appeal to the most people possible, which includes EHG, the developer. It is not, they're important, right? They want to make a particular game and they want to perform in a particular way. And so, of course, what they want really, really matters, but also the people who are playing it really matter. And so finding that balance is really important. And of course, you'll never appeal to everyone. Not everyone will appreciate what you do. There are a large spectrum of gamers, even within a particular genre. So no matter what you do, someone's not going to like it. But there is probably a sweet spot where the most people will like what you've done and find it to be satisfactory. And so let's start by talking about that. And then once we've got down the areas that we need to hit in order to have a trading system that is the best for the most players, I'll give you my example of what that could look like. So first off, we're going to talk about what 11-hour games wants out of trading as far as we know from previous information. Of course, we're looking here at the very first iteration of the Bazaar, the very first real information they ever gave us on it. And so this is going to be outdated, but most of what's in here is stuff that they've pretty much stuck to as far as things that they want to be true about the game. So the first one is giving players the tools they need to trade effectively without having to rely on third-party sites by supplying adequate search and filter tools and enforcing a standard currency in gold. Now, this is something that they generally haven't talked too much about except for the gold thing. They are sticking to the gold standard, so to speak. Which is fine. This isn't really meant to talk about gold and whether or not it's better than crafting materials as a currency. That's a different video altogether. But for my 2 cents, I think gold is fine as long as you have enough gold sinks or money sinks built into the system so that hyperinflation doesn't occur and you don't get a situation where new players are effectively unable to enter the economy. But I think they can do that no matter what trading system they have, so it doesn't really too much matter here. But what does is the third-party tools. Now, they haven't said a whole lot about that stuff lately, but I'm going to assume that they still want that because, well, that's a pretty good thing to want in your game, that people don't have to go through 12 different websites to figure out how to trade their item. A la PoE, obviously not really 12, but probably 3 or 4 for a lot of people. That's a lot of work and a lot of effort outside of the game. If you really want to keep people in your game, then you want to try to avoid that. Now, the second thing they want to do is keep gold meaningful by ensuring it has an important use of the standard currency while at the same time draining it from the economy, making it difficult to trade hands in unsanctioned ways. And this goes back to the first one with the gold thing. We're going to kind of just skip over this because, again, there's lots of ways of doing this. The only part here that's really important is that making it difficult to trade hands in unsanctioned ways, which is going to lead into 3 here, which is deter real money traders from both plaguing the community with spammers and giving players a way to buy power rather than earn it by rendering the best gear untradeable and designing the Bazaar to make coordinated trade difficult to accomplish. So I actually think there are 2 things that they're saying in here, and they have echoed both of these numerous times and recently, so there's no reason to think these are not still the case. The first one being that they don't really want RMT. Of course, who does? I guess some people do, or some developers do, but they usually want it like to them, like through pay to win. But that's not EHG. That's not their goal here. They don't want RMT in the game. Now, let's be realistic. That's impossible. You're never going to be able to completely shut out RMT without completely shutting down trade. I guess technically Diablo 3's probably sort of done that. But again, they've shut down trade as far as any real economy goes. So if you're going to have some sort of economy, some sort of way of trading that is profitable for the player or players, RMT is inevitable, but that doesn't mean you can't limit the amount of RMT to try to minimize the impact on legitimate players. So let's assume that that's what they want to do. They want to limit RMT as much as they reasonably can without having serious downsides. The other thing that they want to do is not devalue item acquisition through gameplay. So the stuff that you get in the world, they want to matter, not just as a way to sell to get the item that you want, but actually as a way to get the upgrades that you need in and of itself. So not just getting everything off the auction house and then selling everything that you pick up on the auction house to acquire those things, which I am 100% for that. I completely agree. That's a really good thing to want. And along with that comes some comments they've had about not making the game an economic simulator, like not making it like where you just spend all of your time buying and selling, and that's the primary purpose for you of the game, which some people really like, of course, but Not everyone does, and EHG doesn't want that. And so we can add that into our trade goals. They don't want an economic simulator. Great, fine. That's one of our goals. So that pretty much covers the basics to me of what EHG wants. I'm sure there's a lot more they want, but not a whole lot that's out there. Maybe not like these high-level general concepts. But the community also has some things they want. I'm going to speak for the community in this case, with conversations that have been going on to give a general idea of what it is. It's definitely going to echo my own thoughts pretty strongly because, of course, I'm giving a lot of my own thoughts, and this is my video. So not everyone's going to necessarily agree with these as like pillars of design that they want for the trade system. But I personally think that this will be the things that the majority of players would be satisfied with that are going to play this particular game. So first, you want to make trading relatively convenient. You don't want too much friction. Third-party websites are an example of friction. Forcing players to trade amongst themselves is an example of friction. Having a bazaar where you can't choose the items that you actually want to go with a search bar, where you only have a very limited set of the items that are actually available for trade, is friction. You don't want too much of that. You want to be able to get into trading, get what you want, and get out. Because again, this is a game about killing monsters, not about trading. If you don't want an economy simulator, you want to make sure people aren't spending too much time trading. And that really does match well with what a lot of players want. They don't want the trade system to be so cumbersome that it's taking away from their gameplay. The other thing that players want is a meaningful trade system. They don't want trading to be kind of an aside that you might do if you're bored, but you're not really going to use it in a meaningful way to upgrade your gear or progress in the game in any capacity. And of course, that would be really important for a trading system. If you don't have meaningful trade, then kind of what's the point? And this is again was a concern about the bazaar, is if you can't find the items that you want, if it's so hard to get it, is that really meaningful? And it's a concern going forward of what items are going to be limited. Are you going to have enough items that are valuable to the player in trade that they're going to want to interact with trade consistently and relatively frequently, depending on their taste? And the last thing that I think players really want to make sure it's in there is if you don't want to trade, if you are someone who doesn't like trade, that there's a reasonable way for you to play the game that doesn't require you to trade. This is somewhere where, in my opinion, PoE really fails. They don't balance for solo self-found. And so if you play solo self-found, which you can, but you are working against all of the balance for trade, which assumes, of course, that you are acquiring lots of gear through methods that aren't through the game, aren't game acquisition, killing enemies. This really does dovetail well with kind of what the EHG devs want, because if they want it to be meaningful for you to kill enemies and do events or whatever, the mechanics of the game, and get your gear that way as one of the primary ways to get it, then, well, you do want players who don't want to have to trade to be able to acquire their own items without it. But it doesn't necessitate that that'll be the case, because you could have some items drop in the world be meaningful and easy to, not necessarily easy to acquire, but target farmable or something that the player can realistically get, while other ones effectively require you to trade. And if that were to exist, that'd be bad for the SSF crowd. So what we really want here is that they balance for SSF and they balance trade in a way that maybe trading gives you an advantage. Of course, you want it to give you an advantage. Otherwise, what's the point of trading? But that SSF players aren't so disadvantaged that they can't make the builds they want to and, do all of the content. All right, so we have covered the priorities for both EHG and players to make a balanced system that both will hopefully be generally satisfied with. But what kind of system can actually accomplish that? So I'm going to here present to you what I believe could do that. This is not like me saying that EHG has to do it this way and only this way or else it won't work. It's just an example of, look, this can work. You can do this. You can actually satisfy both sides of this. And here are some systems that are already in place that other games use that will do that. So we're going to go with an auction house style with bind-on itemization, and we're going to use a gold economy because A, ESG is already committed to a gold economy. That's what they want. And B, auction houses generally work with gold economies, so it actually fits really well. And there's nothing wrong with the gold economy. If someone tells you that gold economies don't work, That's because they only probably ever play PoE and they only know of the trading system in there, and they think that because that's the only trading system that really works really well in an ARPG, it's the only one that can work. But MMOs have done this for longer than PoE has, and they battle things like inflation with no problem with gold sinks, which we'll talk about later. So that shouldn't be a worry. Diablo 3 had an auction house, of course, and people can point to that and say, oh, look, it doesn't work because Diablo 3. Well, Diablo 3's auction house had a lot of issues that had nothing really to do with the auction house itself. The real money was the major one. If you can trade stuff for real money on an auction house, then how do you handle inflation? Answer is you don't, and that system just kind of broke itself. But that had nothing to do with it. An auction house system in and of itself, any real money that's added to an economy is a problem, which is part of the reason why EHG wants to limit it. So an auction house should work just fine. And so here's how it's going to look for LE if this system were in place. You have a tradable item, and you can do one of two things with it. You can go to the auction house, or you can trade it in some form to players. We're restricting trade. This is mostly for EHG so that they can help limit their RMT. I don't think this part is necessary, but it does help with that. So if you decide to trade it with other players, you can do it in party with no restriction whatsoever. So just like Diablo 3, you're in a party, if something drops, someone wants it, you can give it to them. On your friends list, if they're on there for a period of time, let's say 48 hours, now you can trade with them. Or in guild, there's not a guild currently in the game, but if there ever was one, similar to your friends list, you could do that. Now, this doesn't completely prevent RMT, nothing ever will. So let's not, fool ourselves. We're just trying to limit it to the extent to where EHG is happy with that, but that players aren't under so much friction that they don't want to trade. So I think this is a good balance for the player direct trading. We also have the auction house so that you don't need to worry about trading with every average Joe out there, player direct, because you're going to use the auction house anyway. This will be the majority of people's trading experience. So you go and you list the item. There's a pseudo-random timer before the item actually appears to buyers. This is actually to prevent abuse cases in RMT as well, where someone wants to trade an item for real money to another player, but they want to try to get around all the other restrictions that are already in the player direct restrict. So they go to the auction house, they list it, the other person is waiting for that thing to show up in real time, like they're refreshing constantly, it shows up, they buy it for like almost nothing, and then they give them their real money. If you pseudo randomize when it shows up, it's a lot harder to do that, so this will at least help with such a situation. From there, the buyer can search for and find and purchase your item once it appears on the auction house, and then they get the item in the mail and you get the gold in the mail. That's it. That's a very simple system. That's the beauty of an auction house, is it's a very simple system and easy for the player to understand. So low friction in that regard. The simplicity is beautiful. Yeah, it causes just very, very few issues. Do notice that I just said you purchase the item. I didn't mention anything about doing an actual like real auction where you bid. You could do that if you want to. I just think it's not really necessary. It's neither here nor there whether they do the bid. As long as they do the buyout, that's important. They can't not do the buyout, because if bidding will just, if it's only bidding, that's a huge issue for player convenience. So I'm just assuming that we're just going to buy the stuff via buyout, like you'd buy at a store, which most auction houses in games do anyway, and it's the primary way that you get it. If you want to bid, if they wanted to add bidding, that'd be fine. Okay, so that is how the auction house part works. But we still have two other pieces to the trade system that we need to cover: the gold economy aspect of it and the bind on itemization. And then we have to link all three of these up with the priorities of both EHG and the players to see how they fit and make those priorities a reality. So let's start with the gold economy. To run a gold economy, or any economy, you need to manage inflation, and how PoE manages inflation primarily is through their crafting system, where by crafting with one of the pieces of currency, you effectively remove it from the economy. It is no longer usable. It is deleted. It's destroyed. It's used up in that craft, and so you can handle the inflation problem pretty well with that. But when you're using a gold economy, you don't have access to that, since gold isn't used directly, at least in crafting. So here are some ways that you can create gold sinks that can limit inflation in a gold economy. By the way, it's worth noting that no system will completely prevent inflationary problem of some sort in video games like this, because it's so easy to usually make currency. PoE still has a lot of inflation in their leagues, so we're not going to completely eliminate inflation. That's not the goal. It's just to prevent hyperinflation where new players can't really access the economy. So here are some options. Some of these already exist. For example, Lightless Arbor is a dungeon where you can literally dump millions of gold in one run if you want to. The respec system, where you have to spend gold to respec your passive points, that already exists. Stash tabs is already a major gold sink, especially once we have seasons where you'll need new stash tabs probably for every new season. NPC vendors exist but can be expanded upon. So early game, generally people buy some of their shattering runes from the NPC, but NPC vendors could sell more than that, more valuable things, and be a much better gold sink. There are also lots of ways that we can add gold sinks that don't exist in the game. For example, if we add an auction house, we'll already have probably a listing fee and a sales fee that would go along with that. That's an immediate gold sink just for trading, so it already takes some of the gold out of the economy just from the very fact that you're going to trade using the auction house most of the time. Monolith of Fate Echo rerolls would be an amazing addition to the game, because right now echoes can be really painful if you get the wrong modifiers. So if you could re-roll those at least once with some sort of gold expenditure, it's a good gold sink and an additional quality of life for the player. Transmog system has been talked about for something in the future. It would make a lot of sense. And if you had like some sort of gold cost for transmog, especially for when you don't buy it through microtransactions, like it's just transmog from one item that exists in the game to another, that would be a really good way of potentially adding some gold sink. Shard gambling is something that's been brought up, or a shard system where right now you have maybe 1,000, 2,000 or more, for example, strength shards in your inventory because they're so easy to get, like attribute shards. Some of them are really common. If you had a system to where you could maybe gamble 10 of those to potentially get a more rare shard, and that costs a little bit of gold to do every time, there's another gold sink. So there are a lot of ways you can do this. You use special league mechanics to create more gold sinks. Every time you create a new league mechanic, maybe there's some system that goes along with that you expend some gold to do something with it. A ton of options exist as far as gold sinks go for EHG. So this is all to say that I'm really not too worried about gold sinks. They're already showing some interest in making gold sinks through Lightless Arbor and the stash tab system. I have little doubt that they will continue to add more gold sinks to the game, and they'll be able to tune those to make the inflation problem under control, keep it under control. So I think we'll be fine there. So let's move on to bind on anything, really. Bind on pickup, bind on equip. And in this case, we're talking a lot about bind on trade, bind on craft. So EHG could do really kind of any of the bind on options or any combination of them and generally hit their priorities pretty well. But they do think bind on trade and bind on craft will do a better job of hitting those priorities. I also think they have some benefits in that they're a little bit better suited for the genre. They just kind of fitted better. And bind on craft in particular is a bit more novel. I don't know of any other game that does it. So it could be a system that is kind of like more tied to LE than really any other game, like where you just mostly see it here. And I think it actually would work the best. So I'm going to push for bind on craft as something that should seriously be considered. But again, any of the bind ons I think would be a good choice. They should do some sort of bind on system, and bind on trade would be another good option. But let's go through why I think those are the two best, and why I think bind on craft is even better than bind on trade. We'll start with bind on trade. So some of the pros, this pro is for both trade and craft. They're both really good at preventing an economic simulator. If on bind on trade, you limit it to one trade and bound. So I have the item, I trade to you, it's now bound to you. You cannot trade that item any more than that, and you have two problems. One, you start to creep in the economic simulator problem where you can just like buy and sell. It's a little bit harder on a bind on trade because items get devalued the more you trade them until you get to the bound, but it still can happen. And the other issue is the fact that you do have a number of trades. You can fool players that are new, that don't really understand the system, and they can get abused by not grasping the fact that these items are getting devalued the lower the trades they are. And like an item that has 2 trades left versus an item that has 1 trade, there's a huge difference in the value of that. If they don't get that, they could buy the item that has 1 trade and then get it bound to them, and they can't resell that, and so they really kind of got screwed if the one that had 2 was the same price. So I think that's just too much complexity, and if you just keep it to 1, it's simple, it fits the priorities better. That's what I think we should do. So let's assume we do that. It makes a great economic simulator preventer. You can't play the market if you can't trade it again after you buy it. You can also, in this system, of course, craft and trade gear for profit. So you get an item that drops, and you have good materials, and you recognize this is not an item that maybe you don't want to wear, but you know it's really good for a particular build, and you are skilled enough with the game to know how to craft that up. And you attempt the craft, which is a risk, of course, because forging potential isn't guaranteed to make a good item, but you risk it, and you make a really great item, and you make a lot more money on it. That's a great feeling and a really fun way to be able to interact with an economy that would be a great benefit for trade for sure. Would love to have it if we could have it, and bind on trade would allow you to do that, since you can craft as much as you want and then trade the item once and you're good to go. Now the cons of that system are you can probably trade the best gear in the game, because that system doesn't prevent crafting, and to make legendaries you craft, you have to put together 2 items, and when you smash them together you get a legendary. That's crafting. Or you could craft on Exalted to make it even better. And so you end up with the best items in the game potentially being traded in the economy, which kind of goes against the priority of not devaluing item acquisition through gameplay for BHG. Now you could add a bind on like pickup or something like that to the system as well, but you get a little bit more complicated when you do that. And I like to keep it simple, so I think it would be better to not get into that level of complexity if you can avoid it. The other issue is, how do you handle traded items that are crafted into new ones? So you trade for an Exalted and you trade for Unique with LP, and you smash them together into a legendary. Can you trade that legendary? Again, it's not an insurmountable issue. You could just say, well, it's bind on pickup if it's a legendary, and so it doesn't matter. Or in that case, you have to go down to some other sort of craft. And you say, like, if you have one sort of traded item in it, then you can't trade it. But these rules get a little bit weird, and they get a little bit hard to understand, especially for new players. And again, there are some issues with bind on trade that create levels of complexity and design that I think would be better to avoid. And I think bind on craft can do that. So let's talk about bind on craft. So it still prevents economic simulator, not completely. Like anything that you don't craft on, you can trade multiple times, which is a pro of it, but also potentially a con, because someone could play the market a bit on non-crafted items. But since you're limiting trade to not the best items in the game, there's not nearly as much benefit of doing that. And you could also just avoid this problem by having a trade limit. Like, you can only trade 10 items at a time, and so you really can't manipulate the market all that much if you can only trade 10 items at a time. So overall, though, it will prevent an economic simulator, and with some tweaks, really prevent an economic simulator from occurring, which, again, is an EHG requirement of the system. The other pro is the best gear is created by the player. It's not bought by the player. The best gear is created by the player, I should say. That's a better way to word that. So in this case, you have to create the very best items by either making a legendary or crafting up an item that you purchased. You can't straight up purchase the item that's already crafted or already turned into a legendary. And if you're making a legendary, you have to go run the dungeon, and you have to go kill the boss, and so you have to play the game, which is, again, one of the big priorities of EHG is not devaluing item acquisition through gameplay. Problem solved for the most part. Now the best items in the game still require gameplay, and you can still have a robust trade system through bind on craft. We also mentioned that you can trade an item multiple times, so this can be beneficial for, say, you buy a few things that you think you're going to maybe put into a craft, but then you realize you don't want to. Maybe you switched your class or something, or your build, and you want to trade those. Those still have value as long as you haven't crafted on them. So there's some value there. Now, there is one big con of bind on craft, which is you can't craft for profit, which is a big pro of trade. And this is, for some people, a really big deal, and it's something I would love to have. I'd love to be able to craft for profit, make something amazing, and then sell it for just a buttload of money. But if we have to take a hit somewhere in the system, if something just has to be like, well, that's not quite as good as you want it to be, to make sure that all the priorities for EHG and the players are generally hit, this is the one I personally am willing to take, the one that I think is the best one to chop off if you have to take one. So I'm going to go ahead and take the L on the can't craft for profit, because I think all of the other benefits are so huge in comparison. And so that's where we're going to end up with that one. Okay, that's the bind on trade versus craft. Let's go into the priorities now between EHG and the players and see how these systems combine to meet those requirements or those priorities for EHG and the players. So under our priority section, we've got 4 priorities for EHG and we've got 3 for players. So let's go through these one by one and discuss what this system does to help meet the priorities for each one. Starting with EHG, the first one is which is to limit real money transactions, people using, real cash to get items in the game or gold or whatever it might be, some sort of power in the game with their wallets. So you have a number of systems here that help. First, you have the bind on trade craft, which limits kind of like the high-end power of these items and value of those. So there's not quite as much incentive to RMT. Like if you can't make a legendary, you can't buy a legendary, then your incentive is somewhat less, but it certainly isn't zero because there still are items that you can trade and craft for that have value, and you want that, or else your trade system is kind of pointless. So you need more than that. So we've also added auction house trade limits, which will prevent how easy it is for people to acquire wealth to do things like gold selling. Auction house post randomization, which makes it harder for an RMT purchase to occur through the auction house itself. And from player direct trade restrictions, which also makes it harder to make RMT transactions directly. You still can do it through like guild or friends, but it's going to be harder to do that. There's going to be more hoops you have to jump through, and so it creates friction for that system. Again, remember, you can never truly eliminate RMT if you want to have a robust economy trade system, and so that's not the goal here. It's just to make things harder. Now, another thing on top of that makes things harder is that there's a $35 price tag on the game. So anyone who gets caught doing RMT and gets banned is going to pay a hefty price to create a new account and buy a new copy of the game to do so. So there's already a built-in RMT limit just for the way that the game is monetized. These would be on top of that, making it even harder. This would definitely be more difficult to do than on PoE by a lot. And so it would be a limiter of RMT. The next one we have on here is to not devalue item acquisition through gameplay. And how we're going to do that is pretty much primarily through the bind on pickup / trade / craft system, which makes sure that some items are still valuable and cannot be acquired just specifically through the trading system. In fact, the best stuff in the game under most of these circumstances would not at all be purchasable through the trade system. You might be able to buy components of it, but you can't buy the whole thing. And so you definitely still need to play the game in order to get the best gear. The third priority for EHG is to not create an economic simulator, and we're going to handle that through the bind on pickup trade craft again. We've listed the pros for that and how it prevents the economic simulator, and also the auction house trade limits on top of that would make it very difficult for someone to just like play the economy to try to make their money. They can do it to some extent, but the reality is they're probably going to be a lot better off by actually playing the game and finding good items and then selling those, and actually using the economy in the way that it was maybe designed to be. And the last one for EHG is to not need a third-party app for trade. If you want to do that, you have to have a good UI in the game. And if you need an auction house, you need a good UI, or at least a functional one. And so this is just on EHG to make that auction house UI fully functional and easy to use for the player, and just a more convenient option than going and using a third-party app, a website of some sort. But because they're using an auction house in the scenario and they're going to need a UI anyway, and trade is pretty simple in the game and pretty low friction, then this is not a super difficult step to manage. This is something that the auction house is actually assisting them in doing. Okay, so that's it for EHG. I think this would pretty well hit all of their priorities, unless they wanted like even more stringent RMT. But again, you have a push-pull there. The more strict you are on RMT, the more friction you tend to add to the trading system. And so I think this is about as far as they should go without, without inadvertently doing damage to the player base that just wants to trade legitimately. So for players, and this kind of goes right into the limiting of RMT. We do want trading to be relatively convenient and not too much friction. So a fully functional auction house UI would be a very convenient thing to do. I also add on to here, like a bind on craft would be convenient insofar as it would be simple to understand. I think that trade would have more friction if you start to add extra rules to it, like if you had to bind on trade system with extra rules. And so I think the bind on craft also could be put in here as a function of this, but the auction house UI would be the predominant one. It would be the one that would give the most convenience, the lowest level of friction, while also allowing them to still limit RMT. Players also want trade to be meaningful. You want to get like legitimate upgrades and be excited about stuff that you buy in there and use it to make gold that you can actually, then benefit from in other parts of the game. I didn't put in here gold sinks, but if you have gold sinks, that makes trade more meaningful if you're acquiring wealth through the trade system. But also being able to trade some powerful items, but not others, through, for example, bind on craft or bind on pickup, would definitely help to make the game meaningful, because you're allowing the player to trade certain items that are still powerful, but still maintaining the ability to prevent them from trading everything and keeping the acquisition through gameplay not devalued. So you have that balance there. I think it's maintained with a system like this, especially if it's like a bind on craft system. And the last one is to make it so players who don't want to trade don't have to. And it's a really big one. If you want to play these games but you just don't like trade can be a complete turnoff for you. So if we prioritize SSF balance, solo self-found, where you can play on your own and you don't need to trade, that's a big step towards this. And this is something that PoE does not do at all. It's something that EHG has said they want to do. They intend on prioritizing SSF balance, making sure that SSF is balanced for players. A huge step right there already to help the folks who don't want to trade. Bind and craft also helps in that it limits the top end of items that would be traded anyway, so there's not such a huge disparity between the SSF and the trade base. There's going to be disparity. If you want a meaningful trade system, you have to be able to benefit from that, and if you benefit from that, then you're better off trading than not trading, which is what SSF is. So SSF will be a disadvantage in any scenario like this, but you want to make sure it's not so disadvantaged that they feel like they're being punished instead of being challenged. And a bind and craft system, I think, helps assist to that, because it does limit the top end potential of trading. The other piece to the puzzle, the other component, would be realistic drop rates for important items. And right now, the game does a pretty reasonable job of this. Like, if you need to make a build and you need a particular item, in a solo self-found environment, you need to be able to acquire that item on your own by your own means. You can't rely on trade. And so, like, if you needed Wings of Argentis to complete your build, you have to be able to get that. And right now, Wings of Argentis drops off of God Hunter Argentis on Empowered at about a 20% drop rate. That's completely target farmable by a solo self-found player. Content's not too difficult, and you can get it relatively reliably. That's exactly the kind of steps you need in a game like this in order for SSF to be able to make the builds they want to. And as long as they continue to factor in that reality that the items that are build enabling or really build defining can be acquired through reasonable means by the player base. The Rune of Ascendance was added recently, which allows you to target farm any random drop, any random world drop in the game. It doesn't necessarily going to come to you easily, but it gives you like a method for finding these items. That's the kind of stuff you need to make sure that the game is still viable for SSF. So I think this system, along with what EHG already has in there, would hit on all of the priorities of both EHG and the player base. And it's going to be about as balanced as you can be and satisfy about the maximum number of players you're going to be able to. Again, you'll never satisfy everyone. Someone won't like it, but I think it hits on both sides of the aisle enough that the majority of people, the vast majority of people, will be pretty happy with it. And that's what we're going for here today. So that is my idea, my concept, and my example of how we could make this work with a trade system that is making just about everyone you can happy, including EHG and the player base, whichever side of the aisle you happen to be on trade, whether you like it or not. All right, thank you so much for watching. I really hope that this video sparks a discussion on trade that is productive and maybe helps EHG with give some ideas, whether it be mine or from people in the comment section. Please do comment whether you like it, whether you think there's issues with it, whether you have other ideas to add on to it or to replace with it. Would love to hear what you guys think about it. And then I do know that EHG has a tendency to watch these videos and check them out and see what they're all about, and they do definitely add those as a part of their feedback. So maybe we can have a positive effect on trade before it comes out through this video and through other discussions that we're having in the community. Thanks again for watching. I hope you have a great time in Last Epoch, and I will see you all again real soon.